All right, this is lecture 16C. So I've gotten us up to, about 900, 1,000 or so. The feudalism is getting established. They've fought off the Muslims and the Vikings and the Magyars. They're starting to get things better organized. And so then Europe enters this period called the High Middle Ages. This is basically 1,000 to 1,300 CE. And Europe really takes off as a society. I mean, during the High Middle Ages, the population of Europe about triples. You see the creation of new cities and a whole new civilization. And most of the things that we think about of medieval Europe, all the fancy castles, the big cathedrals, all that, that's really from the High Middle Ages. It's about this 300 years where Europe is really humming along and doing really well. So I want to talk about why Europe turned it around. What happened? Well, at first, I should mention this since, from Charlemagne onward, Europeans had sort of been painstakingly building a prosperous society. But there were a number of things that happened in the 900s that really, and early 1000s, that really helped Europe take off. One is there's a bunch of new technologies in crops. Okay. Europeans before this had used a Roman system of using plows, and basically what the Romans had done is when they hooked a horse up to a plow, they just put sort of a rope around its neck and told it to pull, but of course the harder the horse pulls, the more it's choking itself, so horses can't pull very hard with that kind of harness. Well, in the late, early Middle Ages, just before the High Middle Ages, Europeans invented the horse collar, which sits around the horse's shoulders, basically. It allows horses to pull much harder, and oxen, etc. And once they did that, they allowed them to have heavier plows, and the plows that they had developed, the heavy wheeled plow, which could really dig deeper and turn over more soil. Well, this brings more nutrients from down deep in the soil up to the surface where the plants can get it. And so this increases yields per acre of field dramatically. So Europe has more food, right? In addition, Europe discovers a number of new crops, especially beans, that come from the Middle East, and these beans provide protein in a way they never did before. And this allows for better nutrition, which allows for more people to survive, which allows, et cetera. And so these two new technologies are really helpful. The Europeans also developed the windmill to help them grind grain and things like that, or pump water. And so there's a lot of new technologies that really improve productivity. They also come up with new ways of rotating crops to get more productivity by leaving certain fields fallow, et cetera. So overall, Europeans increase their food supply. But another thing that helps them is that it seems that, I talked about the climate change. The middle of the Roman Empire was called the Roman Optimum, which is a warm period where lots of productivity. And then in the early part of the Middle Ages, it got cooler. Well, beginning about 1000, it gets warmer again. And throughout the High Middle Ages, till about 1300, the temperature is warmer, which means better growing seasons, more productivity, et cetera, also. In addition, of course, you get more order, right? With the establishment of feudalism and the establishment of fairly larger kingdoms, more stable kingdoms, in particular the Holy Roman Empire in Germany and Italy, the French Capetian monarchy, and then in England, you see after the Norman conquest in 1066, you see a much more efficient and highly centralized monarchy there. And so feudalism combined with these other technologies really produces a much more stable and prosperous society. But then, of course, that leads to the growth of a lot of things that had withered before. And so one of the things you see is that the church really, after 900, the church really takes off in terms of its power and its authority and its wealth. Because as European society gets wealthier, the church taxes everybody 10%. It's the tithe. Now, it varies a little bit from region to region, whether it's 8% or 12%, but roughly 10% of the Europe surplus goes to the church. And as the population grows, the church is getting more money, right? And the church begins to use that money in a number of ways, but the church does a bunch of things. The church develops a bureaucracy of highly trained, skilled, literate people who become, they sort of rent themselves out as bureaucrats for kings who need trained bureaucrats, but this allows the church's influence within European governments to rise because kings are relying on churchmen to be their bureaucrats and their ministers, etc. And the church also develops the papacy gets much stronger as far as imposing its will on bishops and archbishops and unifying the church and really making the church into an efficient, solid bureaucracy. And the church becomes the most powerful organization in Western Europe. It really becomes the sort of heart of Western Europe. And some of the most powerful popes, like Innocent III, they can topple kings if they want to, right? And then finally, with the growth of more agricultural production, better climate, etc., you start to see the emergence of trade, cities, and much greater wealth in Europe. The trade begins to take off as Europeans begin to produce more. They start to sell, grain to other regions, and then some regions start to specialize in, say, textile production, or producing, dyes, or producing metal goods, or what have you. But you start to see cities start to specialize in things, leather goods, what have you. And you see trade start to pick up. And at first, it's just regional trade. The people in this region start trading with each other. But then you start to see long-distance trade emerging as, for instance, wool producing, sheep growers in Scotland and England start selling their wool to merchants in Italy. And the merchants in Italy start to sell their textiles around the Mediterranean, and then even start to get tapped into the Silk Roads, and merchants from Italy start to head for China and India and the Middle East. And so you start to see Europe become reintegrated into this trade networks with China, with India, with the Middle East, around the Mediterranean, etc. And this causes cities to grow again. The cities had shrunk by about 90% after the fall of the Roman Empire. Now they bounce back to being basically at the levels they were at the end of the Roman Empire. And as I mentioned, the population of Europe triples over the course of the High Middle Ages. And you began to see wealth. You began to see merchants become wealthier. You began to see cities become wealthier. You began to see Europeans spending money on things that were luxuries and were unthinkable 300 years earlier. They now become commonplace, right? And so Europe really begins to take off. But what's kind of interesting is this, and we'll talk about this on Wednesday, is that as Europe takes off, it causes a sort of a crisis of conscience, because Europe had been built around this idea of living in the city of God. But now with wealth and cities and trade and all that, the city of the world becomes much more tempting. Right? So we'll see how Europeans decide to handle this when we get on Wednesday, when we turn to the late Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages. We'll talk much more about the High Middle Ages. We'll talk about the Crusades, and then we'll talk about how it all starts to fall apart again.